Today's speaker is Karla Griesbaum. Karla is the Natural Resources, Environment, and Energy Educator in Champaign, Ford, Iroquois, and Vermilion counties. Karla, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining me today. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and I hope that at the end we get some questions. I am going to turn my video off so it's not distracting. And I'm going to hide my meeting controls and let me know if anything goes awry. Okay. There we go. Okay. So now I imagine that everyone on this call has a different view and experience with fungi. Maybe you like to forage them, maybe you've dealt with a diseased tree, or maybe you don't really give any thought to it at all. So my goal with this presentation is to give you a wider scope of fungi in our ecosystems and maybe broaden your perspective. I'm going to be using a lot of probably new vocabulary today, but don't get caught up on the wording. I want you to leave this presentation with more of a sense of wonder and awe of this diverse kingdom. So we're going to go through some form and function, fungi as a disease, the saprotrophs, which are decomposers, fungi as mutualists, lichen, how climate change is involved in these micro community structures, and then we'll do some edible mushrooms of Illinois. Hopefully you didn't come to this webinar thinking it was all about mushrooms. It is a little bit, but there's so much more. Okay, let's start with some form and function. So generally, what is a fungus? It's any group of spore-producing organisms that feed on organic matter. Fungi is a whole kingdom, like Animalia. And like the animal kingdom, fungi range in their form, function, ecological locations, etc. It'd be easy to make a whole presentation on just one form of fungi, like one might do for an animal species. But today we'll be doing a large overview of the most common ways fungi interacts in natural ecosystems in Illinois. So fungi can be anything from single cellular to complex multicellular organisms. They can be found almost anywhere due to their long evolutionary history and the ability to adapt to extreme environments. They can be decomposers that play an important role in the breakdown of dead things and the nutrient cycling that results from that. And they can cause diseases in certain organisms. Or they can be mutualists and form important relationships with plants that help sustain our natural areas. So 3 things all fungi do have in common. First, they have to eat. This is what makes fungi more similar to animals than to plants. They cannot make their own food, and therefore they must find ways to acquire it from other sources. Second, they do not have a vascular system, such as our circulatory system or the xylem and phloem system that plants have that move water and nutrients through their bodies. Fungi use simple diffusion and osmosis. Third, they have cell walls made of chitin. This is a hard substance that gives them some structure. Interestingly, while chitin is not found in plant cells, it is found in the exoskeletal tissue of arthropods, like beetles and crayfish. So here you can get a sense of just how wide the form and function fungi can be. They can be single cellular, like yeast, like in picture B up here, and I think I can turn on my pointer. So this is yeast up here, and it's a single cellular organism. Or they can be really complex, like this bird's eye fungus down here. They also have various growth mechanisms, so they can grow straight out in all directions, inward, in 2 directions, and they have various reproductive strategies as well. So fungi has a pretty deep historical significance. It evolved over 1,300 million years ago, long before the first plant cells evolved. Now, again, you can ignore all the fancy words in this chart. I just want to point out how long-lived fungi is, and that during some of these periods, fungus took on different roles, such as becoming decomposers around this time, or diseases. You can see the origin of white rot, or the multiple origins of brown rots, and then my favorite, as mutualists. So the fossil record tells us that fungi was present and most likely facilitated the move of plant life from water to land about 450 million years ago, as mutualistic fungi provided nutrients and water to these land plants as they developed their own rooting structures. You can also make the connection that as more photosynthesis started happening on land due to plant life, oxygen concentrations also increased, making the way for that Animalia kingdom to increase in numbers as well. Lichen, which I'll talk more about later, developed early in the Silurian area, so that was even before mutualistic fungi developed. But like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there are many different types of fungi, and this is, again, very general. So you have your macrofungi, which is what we normally see. They're often decomposers, and we see them as the mushrooms, although the mushroom is only the fruiting body of these sexually reproducing organisms. And what you see is only a small part of the organism itself. Most of it's underground or within the dead thing that it's eating. Then we have our molds, which are always kind of hanging around, waiting for a nice piece of fruit or some wet wood to feast on. Yeasts are most known in our world for their ability to make dough rise due to their intake of sugars, like in flour, and their output of carbon dioxide, which makes our bread nice and fluffy. Outside of bread, they have a large role in soil structure, soil nutrient cycles, and as a nutrient source for soil organisms. They can also enhance plant growth. Then we have your rusts and smuts, and they're mostly parasitic to plants, infecting the leaves and biomass and taking nutrients directly from plant material. Then we have our mycorrhizae, and these are fungal filaments that associate with plant roots. And this group is one that we hardly see because it's all underground, but it takes up a vast amount of space underground. So it's kind of interesting to think about this large mass of organism under our feet that we don't give much thought to. So while I just got finished telling you that mushrooms are only a small part of the fungal structure, let's take a look at them anyway, since that's what we're most familiar with. So in general, mushrooms will have some sort of cap or surface structure to hold their spore-containing structures. And those spore-containing structures can be gills, pores, tubes, veins, teeth, and so on. And these pictures kind of give you a little bit of an overview of how some of those look. So we've got porous structures underneath their caps, gills like in the oyster mushroom. This lion mane has teeth that come down. This is a coral fungus. And there's even these cup fungi that their spores are on the inside. When it rains, they distribute them that way. So with most mushrooms, you can take the fruiting body, place it on a piece of paper, cover it with a cup to avoid air movement, and you can see the spores. And this is of great use in identification. To get the best results, you can use a black piece of paper and a white piece of paper because sometimes the spores are light and sometimes they're dark, and that way you get a good chance of seeing both of them. So that's what this is, a spore print here. The ring is where the cap emerged from the soil initially, and the stem or stalk can vary in size and presence depending on the dispersal method. Then the vulva is where the mushroom comes in contact with the ground. The mycelium, which is the main body of the fungus that's always underground, are dispersed within the mushroom itself from its larger mass and supports the structure of the mushroom. So these are pear-shaped puffball mushrooms, and this is its dispersal method. So you can guess that when it rains or if there's any disturbance to these, the spores just poof out and they're distributed in the environment. Okay, so now let's talk about the mycelium, the larger part of the fungus itself. So an important distinction I had to learn when I was getting into microecology was the difference between hyphae and mycorrhizae. So both are fungal filaments, or roots, if you will. So fungal roots on their own are called hyphae or mycelium, mycelium being a mass of hyphae. But mycorrhizae is a term given to these structures when they associate themselves with a plant species. So mycorrhizae always have a plant partner. while hyphae or mycelium is the broader term for the fungal filamentous structures. So all mycorrhizae are mycelium, but not all mycelium are mycorrhizae. So fungi can have two different life cycles, sexual or asexual. In sexual reproduction, mycelium combine genetics after mycelium start to grow, and this is where we get mushrooms from. The whole job of the fruiting body is to spread genetic material to other areas in hopes of increasing genetic diversity. But they can also reproduce asexually, where there's no sexual union, and the mycelium are genetic replicas of the parent organism. Okay, I also want to spend a minute talking about symbiosis. I like to think of symbiosis as a spectrum because while sometimes you have a relationship that is fully parasitic or fully mutualistic, most likely it lays somewhere in between. Because fungi needs to eat, they're going to have some relationship with the organisms around them. Symbiosis is the general term for organisms that directly affect each other in one way or another. So, on one end of the spectrum, we have parasitism, and that's where one organism gains and the other is harmed. Then, on the other end of the spectrum, we have mutualism, where both organisms benefit. Then, in the middle, we have commensalism, where there are resources being shared, but there's really no benefit or harm to either organism. Then within this, we can find everything from predation to competition and all other relationships. And fungi can fall anywhere on this line. Oftentimes, you don't get a fungus species that is only a mutualist or only a parasite, but it can actually depend. And it can be anywhere on the spectrum depending on its life history or the environment that it's in. So, a single species may be a mutualist to a plant in one area and a parasite in another. Or at one point in its life, you might have a fungus that's a mutualist, but then it turns rogue and becomes a parasite at another point in its life. And this kind of just depends on its predicament. Okay, we're going to talk about fungi as a disease. I'm going to kind of breeze through this section because this is not my area of specialty. There are folks at the UIC Plant Clinic and most of our horticultural team that can identify the vast amount of plant diseases. But I'm just going to give some common examples here because they really are an important part of our everyday lives, particularly if you have one of them. Okay, so let's start with anthracnose, which is a common environmental fungus that affects our bigger shade trees. So your maples, oaks, sycamores, ashes, and other big shade trees. It infects at the leaf level and it causes the plant to kill the area around the infection site. So you can kind of see in this picture, the fungus is infected at these brown spots, and then as a defense, the plant will kill the area around that spot in order to try to prevent the spread of it. However, this can weaken the leaves and it makes the trees look really thinned out. It's rarely fatal unless you're a dogwood tree, apparently. Okay. Excuse me. Next, we have oak wilt. So oak wilt is another fungus seen in Illinois. It gets into the vascular system of oak trees, which transports water and nutrients. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. And plugs them up, making leaves wilt and die. So that xylem and phloem is where nutrients and water flow, and if it gets plugged up, it's going to kind of kill everything upwards of there. So this one is mostly spread through feeding beetles. Okay, root rot. You may have heard of root rot already, and it happens when a tree or plant is waterlogged and microbial growth is promoted. So fungal growth can make roots turn brown or black and become mushy, kind of in this upper right-hand picture. This is not one kind of fungus, but several that like these wet environments. And they just do really well and start breaking down some of the supporting structure in the roots. Decline can take several years, so it may be hard to recognize immediately, but you could lose your tree down the line. So rust. I actually found a bunch of rust on one of my cedar trees this past week, and it was cedar apple rust like you see in this photo. I have a Juneberry tree right next to it, so I'm going to be watching it really closely. So far, we haven't had an issue with our fruit. However, it has this life cycle where it can overwinter in an evergreen like this, and then take hold on their fruiting tree when the weather's a bit warmer. It can cause reduced vitality, premature defoliation, plus, as you can probably guess, makes the fruit rather unpalatable. Okay, so there are also fungi that infect insects and animals. Many bombi fungal species affect pollinators like bumblebees. Excuse me. And they can be transported through flowers or mating and then brought back to the hives. And this hurts our pollinator populations, which are already stressed by lack of habitat in Illinois. Bees become sluggish, they lay less eggs, and they have increased death rates. When we had stronger populations of pollinators, because we had more habitat, these diseases may not have had much of an effect on populations overall. But today it hits our bees pretty hard. And then, of course, we can see fungal diseases in animals too. One example is white nose syndrome, which occurs in bats. White nose syndrome came to the US in the early 2000s, and due to a lack of evolutionary history here, this fungus has caused immense and rapid declines in bat populations in the US. This fungus infects bats during the mating season, so in the late fall, and grows over winter on the bat's epidermis. So it likes those cooler conditions to grow. This fungus can only grow in temperatures less than 68 degrees Fahrenheit. However, spores can survive for about 2 years without a host. So if a bat can survive until their spring emergence when the weather is warming up, they can clear the infection rather quickly. However, often when the bats start waking up from hibernation, the fungus will cause this immune response. So that results in inflammation of the skin around their wings and tails, which can then lead to tissue damage and then death. Since these initial rapid population declines, bat species have mostly stabilized, but they don't appear to be increasing yet. Also, because bats are so beneficial in their insect foraging lifestyle, their declines have consequences on agricultural producers. So, due to lack of predation on pests, farmers need to use more pesticides to protect their crops. According to one study, bat declines impact both land price and viability. Okay, let's talk about our saprotrophs. So our saprotrophs are our decomposers, and along with some of our animal decomposers like worms, saprotrophs break down dead things, and this is their method of getting the food they need. They harvest the leftover sugars out of the lignin and cellulose, and then they effectively put nutrients from those dead things back into the soil. This is how composting works to give us nutrient-rich amenities for our gardens. Without saprotrophs, we'd have a mess of dead plant matter that would quickly congest our natural areas. Just think of the amount of leaves that are decomposed every year. Saprotrophs are essential to the nutrient cycling system in all of our Illinois ecosystems. They reproduce sexually and give us most of the mushrooms we find, usually on fallen logs or dead things that you find on the ground as the mycelium eats away at the decaying plant material. In this last picture, I don't know if you can see it, but you can see the mycelium sort of creeping over this dead log here. Okay, so this is my favorite subject, fungi as mutualists. So when I talk about fungi as a mutualist, I'm mostly talking about mycorrhizae, which, if you'll remember, is when the fungal hyphae associate with a plant in which the fungus helps the plant access resources from the soil, and then in return, the plant gives the fungus sugars. There are 40 to 50,000 species of fungi that associate with more than 250,000 plant species. It's kind of a big deal. There are different types, and I'll go through some of them to give you a better idea of what they do. But now remember, the intent of this information is not to make you an expert. But what I'm hoping for is just awareness that these relationships exist. In some cases, mycorrhizae can provide up to 80% of host nitrogen and phosphorus. That's a lot of nutrients the plant would be lacking without a fungal partner. Fungal partners can also increase plant defense, either by their presence signaling to the plant that they need to put resources toward defense, or by simply taking up space so that the fungal or bacterial diseases can't get in. Okay, let's start with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, also known as AMF. They make up most of the mass of fungi under the soil. Now again, don't worry about the vocabulary, just focus on this relationship. It can range, but up to 50% of the soil can be mycorrhizae. And once again, it's just kind of interesting to think about this organism under the ground. So you can see in this picture here, our bruscular mycorrhizal fungi actually gets into the cells of the root in the plant. You can see in this photo of a dyed plant root, the fungal structures. So these are buscules, and you can kind of see them here. This is the live photo taken by Cassandra Alsop. So then what's happening is the fungal hyphae are then able to extend the range of water and nutrients the plant would not be able to access otherwise. So the fungi is reaching deeper into the soil to grab water and nutrients and then sending them up to the plant. Then the sugars the plant is making via photosynthesis is sent down to its roots and it's shared with the fungus. And the plant doesn't mind doing this because without its fungal partner, they wouldn't get a lot of the nutrients they need to thrive. Over 90% of plant species have an arbuscular mycorrhizal partner, solidifying the importance of this fungi. This is also a type of fungi that reproduce asexually, so we do not see mushrooms from this type of mycorrhizae. Okay, then we have ectomycorrhizal or EMF fungi. EMF behaves a little bit differently than the AMF fungi. If you remember that evolutionary chart, this type of mutualism formed more recently. And when I say recently, I still mean millions of years ago, just a tad later than the AMF fungi. And they only associate with about 3% of plant species. I'll also note here that plants very seldomly associate with both AMF and EMF fungi. It's typically only one or the other. So EMF, instead of getting into those root cells, it creates this mantle, this hardened net around the cell root. You can kind of see in this picture, it makes the little tiny roots, the root hairs, look kind of bulbous and like they're coated in this soft membrane. And the plant can access nutrients and water through the root cortex. So this type of mycorrhizae does form fruiting bodies. Research is also starting to show that this type of fungi may help plants tolerate harsh environmental conditions, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So some of the main families of trees that associate with EMF fungi are your birches, your pines, your beeches, your myrtles, your dipterocarps, which are more in the rainforest, and your willows. Aha, okay, orchid mycorrhizal fungi. This one's interesting because the plants that this fungus associates with are actually a parasite to the fungus. So we often think of fungi as parasite, but in this case, the plant is the parasite. Parasitic orchids, such as Indian pipe, which you see here, and that can be found in Illinois, are one of the more well-known plant parasites to fungi. You can see that Indian pipe is mostly white. It doesn't have any green, and that tells us that it's not photosynthesizing. It has to get its carbon from somewhere else. In this case, from the mycorrhizae that is also partnered with a photosynthesizing plant or is eating away at a dead tree somewhere else. So it's kind of this triangle of nutrient shifting that makes this plant able to survive. So foliar fungi, so that's fungi that lives in the leaves. And this was my area of research in graduate school. It's not as well studied as soil fungi. So as you already know, fungi in the leaves of plants can be parasitic and cause disease, such as rusts. However, certain types of fungi that infect the leaves of plants can actually benefit the plant. It can protect the plant from parasitic invaders and make the plant send chemical signals that puts resources into defense. It can also decrease herbivory by making the plant extra tough or acidic, or maybe giving the leaves a really bitter taste. And as you can kind of see in this drawing I made, the fungal hyphae inhabit the space between plant cells and the leaves. So while some fungi infecting plants' leaves can be bad, some are actually quite beneficial and help the plant fight off other diseases. It's also been shown to even help the plant withstand changing environmental conditions because of its beneficial services. Okay, so what I want you to take away from this slide is that there are different types of fungi in all different types of environments, even those that are right next to each other. So these are plates of malt extract agar, which is a sugar that fungus really likes to eat. And what I did is I took tiny samples of soil from several areas in my yard to see what would grow. And I'm sure you may have heard the saying that there's about as many microbes in a teaspoon of soil as there are people on this earth. So you don't even have to see the soil going on these plates to get a ton of microbes. So what this shows us is that different types of fungus inhabit different environments, and having the right cocktail of soil microbes, such as fungi, can affect how that ecosystem works. So I took some from our prairie, lawn, garden, and even our chicken coop. And you can just kind of see that some of the different colors and the different fungi that are growing on these plates, depending on the area I took them from. So, for example, in restoration projects, if a plant associates with a specific fungus and that fungus isn't present in the soil at your restoration site, chances are that plant won't do so well, and the restoration process can take a lot longer than if their mutualistic fungi were present, especially if it's one of those relationships where the fungus is providing almost 80% of the plant's main nutritional needs. Okay, so you may have all heard of the term the Wood Wide Web, as it's getting a lot of traction lately. The idea is that mycorrhizae is not only reaching deeper into the soil for water and nutrients for its plant host, but it is also connecting plants and being a highway for chemical signals to pass through from plant to plant. So essentially, trees connected to the same network of mycorrhiza can share chemical signals. So if one tree is being preyed upon by an herbivore, it wants to increase its defense system. The chemicals involved in this travel through the roots and the fungus, and another tree picks it up and increases its own defenses. It's also shown that trees can share nutrients to young plants or even cut off the flow of nutrients to a diseased plant so the disease doesn't spread. So, are the plants talking to each other? What do you all think? It really depends on your own definition of talking and communication, but it is nice to think that they are. So this is just kind of a visual of what I was just explaining. We have a plant being eaten by an aphid, and that herbivory triggers the plant's defense system. So because they share the same mycorrhizal system, the chemicals made in this plant will be picked up by its plant partner over here. And this plant will start defending itself as well. And that can be anything from producing volatile organic compounds, such as VOCs, to producing chemicals that attract insects that eat aphids, like ladybugs. It's also worth noting that as a scientist, we always want to be on the lookout for claims that don't have evidence to support it. So, a little disclaimer, I'll tell you that a lot of research is happening in this field right now to prove these theories and gather more data on how the system works. Yes, it has been shown that this phenomenon is happening by observation and study, but there's a lot more research that has to be done on the mechanisms, particularly the genetic mechanisms behind this form of communication. However, that doesn't mean it isn't widely publicized. It's a really cool concept. So, PBS did a special on the Wood Wide Web back in 2017. Children's books have been made, like this Little Tree in the Wood Wide Web, because what can be cooler to hear as a kid that plants can talk? And if you've ever seen the movie Avatar, the Tree of Souls communicates to all the beings around it and connects everything in their ecosystem to everything else. So it's definitely a really cool concept that people love to hear about. Okay, so one of my favorite topics is lichen. Talk about them next. So lichen is one of my favorite partnerships. You've definitely seen it, even if you didn't know what you were looking at. What lichen is, it's a mutualism between a fungus and an alga that has been around since before plant life ever made it to land. So it's down here before the AMFs and that mutualistic mycorrhizae was a thing. It's a very distinct relationship because the result of this partnership results in an entity that acts as its own organism, so much so that it was given its own taxonomic name. So, the dynamic duo, what can algae do? It can make its own food. It can photosynthesize. What can't it do? It cannot structure itself. It's single cellular, it usually floats around in the water. Then what can fungi do? It can grow rooting structures. What can't it do? It can't make its own food. So it really seems like a match made to be. This relationship allows the two organisms together to inhabit places that neither could do on its own. It can live in some of the harshest environments because it takes the hardiness of the fungi to withstand environmental conditions, all while carrying its food source along with it. Then, relatively recently, it was found that a lot of lichen have a third mutualist, a yeast, that piggybacks on all the things the lichen is doing, but it can also make acids or other compounds that deter predation, effectively protecting the lichen from herbivores that find it a tasty treat. This is what makes it possible for lichen to grow on rocks, volcanoes, tree bark, or almost anywhere there isn't something else already inhabiting. So these pictures give you just a small sampling of the range of forms lichen can take based on the partners involved. The color and texture depends on the kind of fungus and the kind of algae that's occurring in the relationship, and we end up with countless forms, colors, textures, and ecological roles that the lichen can have. Some can glow if they associate with bioluminescent partners. They can be crusty like potato chips. Others are long and flat like a crepe. Some form branches or even hang like curtains on trees. Some are smooth and others like sponges. Some organisms eat them, and they can also act as a filter for the air around them, as well as an environmental indicator of toxins in the surrounding area. So if your lichen isn't doing too well, chances are the air around it isn't too good at all either. Okay, so with everything I talk about, I like to include climate change in there. And our shifting climate leaves nothing untouched. So I'll talk a bit about it and some research surrounding it in the next few slides. So some of the research that I was involved in looked at how increased levels of carbon dioxide affects fungal communities and plants. As you may have already guessed, there are often many fungal and bacterial species that inhabit and partner with an organism. You yourself have a microbial community that resides in your gut and on your skin, and plants are no different. The research I did followed studies by Natalie Christian, who is now based out of the University of Louisville. She took the fungi in the leaves of soybean and studied how the carbon dioxide levels affected these communities either at the current carbon dioxide level or future carbon dioxide levels, which are the levels they're estimated to be at during the year 1950. And what she found was that these communities shift with increasing levels of carbon dioxide. And these communities are important for plant function, so we would expect changing microbial communities to have an effect on the plant itself. So, what does this mean? And that's what I set out to find. So at U of I, a lot of this research takes place at soy face, which is a research field that has these rings where carbon dioxide is pumped in to see how increasing the carbon dioxide affects plants, in this case, soybeans. So we can kind of get a look into what the future is going to look like for plants in these fields. There are other FACE, which stands for Free Air Carbon Enrichment, research centers that look at other plants as well. So there's some really cool research being done on climate change and plant microbe interactions. What I found is that some of soybeans' beneficial fungal partners can help increase a plant's fitness when faced with stress from climate change factors. So whether they aid in defense, growth, photosynthesis, these fungal partners may be one of the keys in helping plants adjust to climate change over the next 50 to 100 years. Some other work I was involved in that really spurred my interest in microbial ecology is being done by Cassandra Alsop and the Lancall Lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So what you see here, this is out at Allerton Park in central Illinois. They're plots where Cassandra took soils from different areas of the Midwest, brought them to central Illinois, and planted seedlings in one area to compare how different microbial communities in the soil affect the growth and resilience of trees to climate change factors, such as drought or cold stress. And what she has shown is that tree seedlings inoculated with microbial communities sourced from drier, warmer, or colder sites were more resilient when faced with drought, heat, or cold stress, respectively. So, for example, if the soil was taken from an area where more drought occurs and then planted here in central Illinois, the seedlings in that soil will be more resilient to drought. And if you didn't already know, climate change is having an effect on our weather patterns, making periods of drought more common, as well as extreme weather events. While overall, we're actually getting more rainfall, it occurs in these large events, and we have longer periods of drought in between. Now, if citizen science is your thing and you want to add to the knowledge base for mycorrhizal fungi, this is a simple opportunity you can take part in anytime. So you can Google the Forest Fungi Project or put in this web address and you'll get instructions on how to get involved. It's very simple and it doesn't take too much time at all. And these are me and my kids several years ago doing it. So something to take away here is that fungi is everywhere. My favorite example of this comes from the discovery of penicillin, the first antibiotic. So what happened here was Alexander Fleming was a scientist, and he was studying Staphylococcus bacteria and had it growing on petri dishes in his lab. Now, because fungal spores are always floating around, there was a contamination on his plates, and a blue mold called penicillium, naturally, started to grow on his plates. What he then noticed were the plates with this contamination also now lacked the staph bacteria, leading him to the discovery of penicillin. So it's a fungus that kills the bacteria that makes us sick. It's also recently been shown that AMF fungi can be found at the highest elevations, even the dust on top of Chicago's skyscrapers. So wherever you go, there they are. Okay, so now the part that some of you have probably been waiting for, but I'll be honest, this is just a slight glimpse into the mushroom world of Illinois. I'm just going to mention a few edible mushrooms that are easy to find, but the range of mushrooms in Illinois is so wide, we would spend hours talking about it. So there are some rules, especially if you're considering foraging for mushrooms, that you need to follow. So first, don't try something unless you are positive of the ID. If you're new, ask an expert. Sometimes it's not even safe enough to follow a book or the internet. It's best to ask somebody. Two, only eat a little to start. Even safe mushrooms can throw a curveball at your digestive system, it's just because it's the first time you've ever eaten it. Three, make sure you forage on permissive land. So you need to check with the landowner or any managing entity first. You can't pick mushrooms anywhere, or any food for that matter. 4, tread lightly, take care of the land and respect it. If you're walking off trail anywhere, chances are you might step on something important, so you want to be careful. Then I have some sound advice that comes from Robin Wall Kimmerer from her book Braiding Sweetgrass. With all foraging, don't take the first one you see, don't take more than half, and only take what you need. So like I said, the following slides are just the tip of the iceberg for Illinois edible mushrooms, but these are somewhat widespread, easy to identify, and a good start for foragers. The following slides are organized by ease of finding, not by taste. Okay, so first I have the giant puffball mushroom. As you can see, they'd be hard to miss. You may have seen it before. If you see what looks like a volleyball sitting in the forest or several volleyballs sitting in the forest, this is probably the mushroom you're finding. Their mycelium are decomposing leaf litter on the forest floor. If you're going to harvest them, you have to do it at just the right time before they start changing into powdery spores. There are smaller puffballs as well, like those pear-shaped puffballs I showed you earlier, but this is by far the easiest one to find just because of its size. Their spores are yellow to green-brown, but if spores are present, chances are you don't want to eat it. This is also a good time for me to tell you that another identification factor you can use is the time of year you see the mushroom. So you aren't going to see giant puffball mushrooms in the spring. They emerge later in the fall. Other mushrooms, like your morels, will pop up in the spring and then you won't see them for the rest of the year. So timing also matters with identification. Then we have our pheasant back or Dryad saddle, and I think it has even more names. This one is widespread and easy to identify. It has this feathered look on its top, and tube-like pores at the bottom of the cap. And their spore print is white, so you often find them on dead logs because they're saprotrophic and they're eating away at the dead stuff. So next we have chicken of the woods, which is another popular Illinois edible mushroom. And as the name suggests, it has a mild flavor and it'll take on whatever flavor you cook it in, kind of like chicken. They do not have true gills and have microscopic pores on the underside of their caps, and they have a white spore print. While they're fairly recognizable, they do have some lookalikes that can be mistaken for chicken of the woods. One of them is the velvet-topped mushroom, which is a type of polypore. It's also edible. Or hen of the woods, which is another delicious yet harder to find mushroom. And this one's also saprotrophic. Okay, lion's mane. It can be tricky to find, but it's also hard to mistake the ID. They have these teeth that hang down from the body and create what look like galls on the side of dead trees or logs. Their spore print is white, and this is another saprotrophic mushroom. They're also quite tasty. Oyster mushrooms. Many of you have probably had oyster mushrooms just from the store or restaurant. They're a culinary treat, but careful ID is needed. They have a very distinct smell. It's almost fishy, but you have to know the smell before you can use it. It does have gills, like you see here. And the spore print is whitish to lilac in color. They create these shells on trees, and they can be many colors. They can be yellow, white, pink, brown, and even blue. As with most mushrooms, these do have lookalikes, so getting to know the species and the variety of colors it can be before trying to eat them is very advisable. Okay, chanterelles. The chanterelle is probably my favorite culinary mushroom for eating because I think it has the best flavor. It's the only ectomycorrhizal mushroom in my presentation. And this can kind of be seen by the way it's not found on dead or dying things, but they pop up from the ground individually, and they're not clustered together because they're rising up from that mycorrhizae that's sharing the resources with the tree roots. They're typically orange to yellow in color, and they have a pinkish yellow spore print. There is a false chanterelle that is classified as non-toxic, but it has been noted to be bitter and cause really bad stomach upset. And it has a white spore print. The false one is typically a deeper orange and has a bit of a fuzzy cap instead of a very smooth one like the true chanterelle. Another common lookalike for the chanterelle is the jack-o'-lantern mushroom. At first glance, you can see the similarities, but experience will tell you that jack-o'-lanterns tend to form in bunches like this because they're saprotrophic, so they're usually eating something dead. They have white to pale yellow spore print, and they're also bioluminescent. So at night, they give off a greenish light in the darkness. So while you should not eat them, they're still a cool find. Okay, now the morels. I saved this one for last because for me, it's kind of the least interesting because it's just so popular. It does have a couple lookalikes, such as the solid false morel, but they're pretty easy to identify. True morels are hollow on the inside and they have a cream to light yellow spore print. There are golden morels, black morels, and even white morels. And if this is what you seek, then good luck to you. They've gotten so popular that if you don't have some private property with a good morel spot, chances are somebody else has gotten to it first. I see them here and there, but when you follow the foraging rules to not take the first one and never more than half, I don't know, I barely find that it's worth my effort. Some are lucky, though, to have them right on their property or in their gardens where nobody else can get to them. Also, if you live in a less populated area, you have a good chance of stumbling upon them as well. Okay, now most of my presentation has been on natural area funguses, but here we are in Illinois where corn is king, and I feel I have to mention corn smut. So this is a fungus that grows on corn and is usually the result of a wound or poor growing conditions. So if a piece of hail might hit some corn and a fungus gets in there, this is usually what will grow. It rarely does not harm the whole cornfield. The funny thing about this fungus is apparently it's delicious. It has been compared to a truffle, which is a very expensive culinary mushroom because it has really great flavor. So if you notice some or you know a farmer who has some, it might be worth a try. All right. And then before I wrap up, I'd like to mention one more fungus that isn't getting nearly the buzz as the current periodical cicada emergence. But like the periodical cicadas, it's also seen only every 13 to 17 years. So this year, the southern part of our state will see brood 19, which is a 13-year cicada brood, and the northern part of the state will see brood 13, a 17-year brood. With these, we'll follow this fungus, which also rests for 13 or 17 years and emerges with the periodical cicadas to infect its host. It'll infect the cicada and it actually releases chemicals that make the cicadas act funny, sometimes making the males flick their wings like a female, so it attracts both males and females to it. And then it kind of works like an STD. So it happens with mating where they're spreading the spores. They can also start to fly erratically, and they've been called salt shakers of death because they're just spreading the spores on the rest of the brood coming up from the soil. So after infecting one cicada, it'll spread to another, but then that fungus will make resting spores that will fall to the ground and remain there for another 13 or 17 years, awaiting the next emergence. If you want to learn more about periodical cicadas, we are offering a webinar next week on Wednesday at 7 p.m. that you can check out with Dr. Ken Johnson. And then that's what I have for you. I have quite a few sources because we're doing science here. And when we do science, we need to have lots of good sources. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
Great. Thank you so much, Karla. That was awesome. And I'm sure others like myself learned a whole bunch. So we
Good.
do have quite a few questions in the box and we'll see how many we can get through.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna pick some and we'll go for it. But starting with, can foraging for wild mushrooms have a detrimental impact on their population?
If you do it poorly. So if you go through and take every mushroom out of an area, then yes, absolutely. You're taking those spores out of there. And if they can't spread their spores, then they can't reproduce for the next generation. However, if you're following the rules of only take half, then they're going to be just fine.
Great. Is there evidence of invasive fungi from other areas that disrupt indigenous fungal/plant relationships?
Well, I'm going to have you repeat the first part of that one.
Is there any evidence of invasive fungi from other areas that disrupt indigenous fungal-plant relationships?
That's a great question. And to be honest, I really don't know. I imagine there definitely are. But yeah, I can't say I know I can't give an example, I guess I would say.
Mhm.
I would say there definitely are invasive fungal infections, especially some of our diseases that we see, like the one that infects bats. But as far as harming it like native species, I'm not quite sure about that.
What can we encourage people to do to create more beneficial fungi within the soil?
Don't touch it. um, tilling, any disruption to the soil is going to disrupt those fungal roots. So kind of leaving the soil to do its thing is the best thing you can do to encourage its growth and survival. And then also planting native plants because our native funguses, just like our native pollinators, like native plants better, and they have deeper roots and just survive better in Illinois ecosystems.
Do you have any thoughts on the state of mutualistic mycorrhizae and agroforestry tree plantings?
So this one, the research is still kind of iffy. I know in urban settings, there's a lot of questions about, well, should I use some of these mycorrhizal treatments in order to make my trees grow better? And the truth is, it really depends. It depends on what funguses are there in the first place. It depends on the tree species that you're planting. A lot of times, if you buy a bag of mycorrhizae, it's not the mycorrhizae that the plants need. Sometimes it is, but it's really hard to tell if that's going to be effective in some of these like conservation farming techniques. So I know that's kind of a frustrating answer, but that's kind of the truth of it is it's so variable at this point.
What can we do to avoid nosema, which affects the bees in our pollinator gardens?
Gosh, that's a tough one. Scientists are working on it. There's some research going on about like trying to put beneficial bacteria in place of the Bombay species that are diseases that can fight the Bombay species. So there might be a bacteria that can try to help clear those infections from the bees. Um, so yeah, another area of research that a lot of folks at U of I are looking at.
Great. I'm scrolling through here, making sure. So someone commented they just noticed several of their second-year prairie plant plugs that overwinter on a raised garden bed with the common brown cup fungi all over them. Will this fungi hurt the plugs?
They will not. Those little brown cup fungi, like the bird's nest fungi, really like mulch. So if you have mulch in your garden, I know I do, and I have those little cup fungi everywhere, and no, they will not hurt any native plantings.
Another person believes they have I'm sorry, I'm going to pronounce this wrong. The Saprotrophs, where they cut down a tree and they grow each summer. Should they avoid mowing them and let them grow?
Um, I always leave logs. They're great wildlife habitat. I guess it kind of depends on the location. If you do want to move it, that's fine too. But I like leaving logs lay just because not only do they grow mushrooms, you don't really have to worry about the mushrooms because they're going to find something else anyway. But they provide habitat for insects, wildlife, almost anything you can think of. So I like to let them lay.
Nice. Another person has found several cedar trees infected with the juniper apple rust this spring, and they're all near one apple tree on the property. It hasn't been noticed in the past years. So has this been an unusually good year for it?
Gosh, that's a great question. So when we found the rust on our cedar tree, I told my husband and he said, "Oh, that's been there for years." I just didn't notice. Um, so and we have a Juneberry tree right next to it, and we always get great Juneberries every year. So, but maybe it's looking for an apple partner. I don't know. I would say I haven't heard that rust is particularly in high abundance this year. But I think the thing to do is just kind of watch your fruit trees if you see that. There are fungicides that you can use to kill the fungus, but just kind of watch them first to make sure that's necessary.
I like this question. Should we avoid eating the cicadas with the fungi?
That's great because I did a presentation on cicadas for a group of fifth graders, and that's one of the questions they asked. And um, I would say yes, I would avoid eating them. I'm not quite sure if that fungus is harmful or toxic, but I sure wouldn't want to eat it. Um, yeah, I think that's the answer to that question.
There's lots of comments thanking you for the great presentation. It was
Okay.
wonderful.
I'm really glad. This is like I said, my favorite topic, and I was hoping to kind of hit if you have never heard of fungus before, all the way up to those that have great interest in it. So hopefully everybody got a little bit of something.
I think I have one more question for you,
Okay.
and then we'll let everyone else go. So what is the impact of selective use of chemicals to help eradicate invasives like honeysuckle? Like, does it migrate through the whole soil layer via the fungus in the soil?
It depends on the herbicide that you're using. So, herbicides like Roundup, which are commonly used for honeysuckle, anything with foliage, they're not going to disrupt the fungi in the soil because they can only enter the organism through the leaves. So, usually by the time that gets down into the soil, it's already not activated anymore. But there are some pesticides and herbicides that can harm, well, especially fungicides, that would help or hurt these mycorrhizal communities. Um, so I guess just careful application. Some of these pesticides and herbicides can also harm pollinators. You just want to make sure you do your research when you're going to apply these sort of pesticides and herbicides to make sure it's not drifting out of the place where it should be.
All right. Well, thank you so much again. I'm
Yeah,
assuming people can reach out to you if they
um,
have more questions, if they have any more content they want to dive into. Um,
absolutely.
Within the chat, I'm sending out the next upcoming June webinar. It'll be on microplastic pollution, and you can find all the recorded everyday environment webinars with this link as well. So thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks everyone for joining.